The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Dr. Mitchell Reynolds adjusted his protective gear one more time. His voice echoed through the sterile white quarantine chamber, cutting through the hum of ventilation systems working. Overtime. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Ma'am, I need you to remove all clothing immediately. Federal health protocol requires complete decontamination. The woman standing before him didn't move. She was average height, maybe 5'6", with auburn hair pulled into a simple ponytail. Her clothes were ordinary jeans, a long-sleeved flannel shirt, worn sneakers. Nothing about her suggested she was anything more than another civilian caught in the wrong place at the wrong time when the outbreak alert had sounded. Her name was Sarah Thompson, according to the intake forms. Age 34. Listed occupation, freelance photographer. Emergency contact, none. The kind of person who moved through life without leaving much of an impression, unremarkable in every measurable way. But Sarah wasn't moving toward the decontamination station. She stood perfectly still, hands at her sides, green eyes fixed on something beyond the doctor's shoulder. Her expression revealed nothing, not fear, not defiance, not embarrassment. Just a strange, distant calm that made the armed security guards shift uncomfortably behind their face shields. "Ma'am, did you hear me?" Dr. Reynolds repeated, his voice rising slightly. Through the observation window, CDC officials watched intently, clipboards ready, protocols memorized. This was day 3 of the Memphis biological incident, as the media had dubbed it. 47 people are already in isolation. Every new case meant more questions, more procedures, more chances for contamination to spread. Security Chief Brandon Walsh stepped forward, his bulk filling the hazmat suit like a balloon stretched to its limit. He'd worked federal facilities for 12 years, dealt with everything from anthrax scares to pandemic responses. In his experience, civilians always panicked at this stage. They cried, they argued, they pleaded for phone calls to lawyers or family members. They didn't just stand there like statues staring at nothing. "Lady, you've got about 30 seconds to start cooperating, or we're going to have to do this the hard way," Walsh growled through his respirator. His hand moved instinctively toward the restraint kit clipped to his belt. Standard procedure for non-compliant subjects. The other guards flanked him. Officer Janet Morrison, 26 and fresh from Homeland Security training, and Sergeant Tommy Briggs, a former MP who'd seen enough action overseas to know when someone was measuring distances and calculating angles. Something about the way Sarah held herself reminded him of soldiers he'd known, but he couldn't put his finger on what exactly. Dr. Reynolds checked his watch. They were already behind schedule. Protocol dictated that suspected exposure victims had to be processed within 4 hours of intake, and Sarah had been sitting in the holding area for 3.5. The longer they waited, the higher the risk became for everyone in the facility. "Sarah, is it?" Dr. Reynolds tried a softer approach, consulting his tablet. "I understand this is frightening, but we're dealing with a potential level 4 biohazard situation. The substance you may have been exposed to at the warehouse district could be extremely dangerous. Every minute we delay increases the risk to yourself and others." For the first time, Sarah's eyes moved. She looked directly at the doctor, and he felt something cold settle in his stomach. Her gaze wasn't that of a frightened civilian. It was calculating, professional, like she was assessing threats and cataloging weaknesses, like she'd done this before. "The warehouse on Riverside Drive," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, no tremor of fear or confusion. "Building 47C. The one with the chemical leak." Dr. Reynolds blinked. That information hadn't been released to the public. The CDC had kept the exact location classified, referring only to an industrial incident in the Memphis area in their press briefings. How did she know the specific building number? "Ma'am, how did you—" "I was there when it happened," Sarah interrupted. "I saw what you're dealing with. And I can tell you right now that your decontamination protocol isn't going to be enough." The room fell silent except for the constant whir of air filtration systems. Security Chief Walsh's hand tightened on his radio. Dr. Reynolds felt his pulse. Quicken. If this woman had direct knowledge of the incident, she could be either their most valuable witness or their most dangerous security risk. "All the more reason to follow procedure," Dr. Reynolds said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Remove your clothing and step into the decontamination shower. We can discuss what you saw after you've been properly processed." Sarah's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Doctor, with all due respect, your little shower isn't going to wash off what I've been exposed to. And if you knew what I've walked through to get here, you'd understand why undressing in front of a room full of strangers isn't exactly my biggest concern right now." Officer Morrison stepped forward, her hand moving toward the taser on her belt. "Ma'am, you need to comply with federal health directives. This isn't a request." Sarah turned to look at the young officer, and Morrison felt her training evaporate under that steady green gaze. There was something predatory in the way Sarah moved her head, like a wolf sizing up prey. The older woman's shoulders shifted, almost imperceptibly, and Morrison suddenly realized she was no longer looking at a potential victim. "Officer Morrison," Sarah said, reading the name tag through the protective gear. "How long have you been with Homeland Security?" Morrison's mouth went dry. That's not relevant to 6 months, 8? Sarah's voice remained conversational, almost friendly. "Let me give you some advice. When you're dealing with someone who's been where I've been, you don't reach for your weapon unless you're prepared to use it. And if you're prepared to use it, you'd better be faster than they are." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. 10 degrees. Dr. Reynolds looked between his security team and the woman they were supposed to be processing, suddenly aware that the power dynamic had shifted in ways he didn't understand. Walsh was reaching for his radio, probably calling for backup. Briggs had gone very still, his soldier's instincts clearly activated. "Sarah," Dr. Reynolds tried again. "I don't know what your background is, but right now you're in a federal quarantine facility under emergency health protocols. Whatever happened at that warehouse, whatever you think you know about the situation, the law requires that you submit to decontamination procedures. I can't let you leave this room until that happens." Sarah nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this response. She looked around the chamber one more time at the cameras in the corners, at the observation window where CDC officials were undoubtedly taking notes, at the armed guards who were trying to look professional while clearly being rattled by her calm demeanor. "Doctor, let me ask you something," she said. "In your emergency protocols, is there any provision for dealing with military personnel who've been exposed to classified biological agents?" Dr. Reynolds frowned. "You're not military. Your intake forms clearly state that you're a freelance photographer." "My intake forms state what I needed them to state," Sarah replied. "But if you really want me to undress, if you really want to see what I've been exposed to over the years, then I'll show you. Just remember that once you see certain things, you can't unsee them. And once certain people know you've seen them, your nice quiet career in civilian medicine might become a lot more complicated." She began to unbutton her flannel shirt, and the room held its collective breath. Dr. Reynolds felt sweat beating under his protective gear, despite the climate control. Something was happening here that was way beyond his training, beyond the protocols he'd memorized, beyond the simple biological containment situation he'd thought he was dealing with. Sarah's fingers moved methodically down the buttons, one by one. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, like she was performing a ritual rather than simply removing clothing. The guards watched with growing unease, sensing that they were about to witness something that would change everything they thought they knew about this unremarkable woman. "Last chance, doctor," Sarah said, pausing with her shirt half unbuttoned. "Are you sure you want to see what's underneath? Because once you do, this stops being a simple quarantine situation and becomes something else entirely. Something that involves people you really don't want to meet and questions you really don't want to answer." Dr. Reynolds found himself caught between protocol and instinct. Every regulation he'd ever studied said to proceed with decontamination. Every instinct he'd developed in 20 years of medicine said to stop and think very carefully about what was happening in this room. "Ma'am, I need you to." Sarah finished unbuttoning her shirt and let it fall to the floor. Underneath, she wore a simple white tank top, nothing remarkable. But as she began to lift the hem of that shirt, preparing to remove it as well, her left shoulder came into view, and that's when everything changed. The edge of something dark was visible just above the fabric line, not random skin discoloration or a birthmark, but the deliberate, precise lines of a tattoo. Not just any tattoo, but something that made Sergeant Briggs take an involuntary step backward, and Security Chief Walsh reached instinctively for his weapon, because even with only a partial view, even through the protective gear that distorted their vision, they could see enough to know that what was etched into Sarah Thompson's skin wasn't the kind of artwork that civilians typically wore. It was something that spoke of specialized training, classified operations, and the kind of service that left permanent marks in more ways than one. Dr. Reynolds felt his mouth go dry as Sarah paused, tank top halfway up her torso, waiting to see if he really wanted her to continue. In that frozen moment, he realized that this quiet woman with the unremarkable appearance and the freelance photographer cover story was about to reveal something that would turn his carefully controlled quarantine situation into something far more dangerous and complex than any biological contamination. The fluorescent lights continued their angry buzzing overhead. The air filtration systems continued their constant whir, and in the observation window, CDC officials continued taking their notes. But everyone in that sterile white chamber knew that they were balanced on the edge of a revelation that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's green eyes met Dr. Reynolds' gaze through his face shield, and in them he saw depths of experience and knowledge that had nothing to do with freelance photography and everything to do with the kind of work that didn't appear on official records or intake forms. "Well, doctor?" she asked quietly. "Still want me to undress for quarantine?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying with it the promise of answers that no one in that room was prepared to hear, and consequences that would reach far beyond the walls of the Memphis Biological Containment Facility. And in that moment of perfect silence, before anyone could respond, before protocols could be followed or decisions could be made, Sarah Thompson began to lift her tank top higher, revealing inch by inch the truth that she'd kept hidden beneath the carefully constructed facade of an ordinary woman caught in an extraordinary situation, the truth that was about to make everyone in that room wish they'd never heard her name. 3 days earlier, Sarah Thompson had walked into the Memphis Regional Hospital carrying a camera bag and wearing the same unremarkable clothes that now lay crumpled on a quarantine facility floor. The admissions clerk, a tired-looking woman named Beverly, had barely glanced up from her computer screen. "Purpose of visit?" Beverly had asked, fingers poised over the keyboard. "Documentary photography," Sarah had replied. "I'm working on a project about urban industrial spaces. The abandoned warehouse district has some interesting architectural elements." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Memphis had dozens of freelance photographers wandering through the city at any given time, drawn by the contrast between gleaming downtown developments and decaying industrial areas. Sarah's press credentials looked legitimate. Her equipment was professional grade, and she carried herself with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this kind of work for years. What Beverly couldn't have known was that Sarah had spent the previous 6 months establishing this identity with the methodical precision of someone trained in deep cover operations. The photography credentials were real. She'd actually taken several courses and built a modest portfolio. The apartment she rented was lived in, complete with developing equipment and framed prints on the walls. Her bank account showed steady, if modest, income from various freelance assignments. The cover was so complete that even Sarah sometimes forgot it wasn't entirely real. She discovered that she actually enjoyed photography and found a strange peace in capturing moments through a lens. It was honest work, creative work, the kind of life she'd never imagined having before everything changed. But 3 days ago, that carefully constructed normal life had collided with something from her past. Something that had brought federal agents to her door and landed her in a quarantine facility facing questions she couldn't answer without destroying everything she'd built. The trouble had started with what should have been a routine assignment. A local magazine had hired her to photograph the Riverside Industrial District for an article about urban renewal. The pay was decent, the work was straightforward, and the location was only 20 minutes from her apartment. She'd packed her gear, grabbed a coffee, and driven out to capture some atmospheric shots of the old warehouses against the morning sky. Building 47C had caught her eye immediately. Unlike the other structures in the district, which showed obvious signs of abandonment, broken windows, graffiti, weeds growing through cracks in the concrete, this warehouse looked different. The windows were intact, the perimeter was clean, and there were fresh tire tracks in the otherwise undisturbed dust around the loading docks. Sarah's trained eye had picked up other details that would have escaped most photographers. The buildings. Electrical meters were still active. The security cameras, while disguised to look old and broken, were clearly functional. And there were subtle modifications to the structure-reinforced walls, upgraded ventilation systems, steel doors where wooden ones should have been. She'd circled the building twice before deciding to investigate. Old habits died hard, and something about the setup had triggered instincts she'd spent 3 years trying to suppress. The careful way the building had been made to look abandoned while actually being maintained suggested government involvement. Possibly military or intelligence operations. Sarah had positioned herself across the street, using a telephoto lens to document the inconsistencies she'd noticed. Through her viewfinder, she'd watched as a delivery truck approached the building unmarked. Government plates, driver wearing hazmat gear. The truck had backed up to a loading dock that had opened automatically, revealing an interior that definitely wasn't abandoned. That's when everything had gone wrong. The explosion hadn't been massive, nothing like the devastating blasts she'd witnessed in places she couldn't name. But it had been distinctive, the sharp crack of high-grade military explosives, followed by the acrid smell of burning chemicals. A plume of greenish smoke had billowed from the building's ventilation system, and alarms had begun wailing across the industrial district. Sarah's military training had kicked in automatically. While other bystanders were running away from the smoke, she'd moved closer, recognizing the signs of a biological containment breach. The color of the smoke, the pattern of dispersal, the specific way it hung in the air, all of it pointed to something she'd encountered before in places that officially didn't exist. She'd managed to get close, enough to see hazmat teams emerging from the building, carrying equipment she recognized from her previous life. Military-grade detection devices, specialized containment units, communication gear that civilian emergency responders definitely didn't have access to. Whatever was in that warehouse wasn't industrial chemicals or ordinary hazardous materials. Her telephoto lens, she'd captured images of faces she shouldn't have recognized, equipment she shouldn't have been able to identify, and operational procedures that were supposed to be classified. The photographs were detailed enough to raise questions that certain people wouldn't want answered. That's when the black SUVs arrived. Sarah had made it 3 blocks before they'd caught up with her. 2 vehicles, government plates, professional. Drivers who'd clearly done this before. They'd boxed her in at a traffic light with the smooth efficiency of people who'd perfected the technique. The man who'd approached. Her car had been polite but firm. Agent Davis, FBI, though Sarah suspected his actual affiliations were more complex than his credentials suggested. He'd been tall, well-dressed, with the kind of careful grooming that spoke of Washington desk jobs and security clearances. "Ms. Thompson, I'm going to need you to come with us," he'd said, showing his badge through her window. "There's been an incident in the area, and we need to ask you some questions." Sarah had considered her options in the split second before responding. She could have run her current identity was solid, but not solid enough to survive serious federal scrutiny. She could have fought her training was still there, muscle memory that never really faded. But either choice would have blown her cover completely and raised questions about why a freelance photographer had the skills to evade or engage federal agents. So she'd gone quietly, turning over her camera equipment and submitting to what they'd called routine processing for potential contamination exposure. The FBI had been professional, even apologetic, explaining that everyone in the vicinity of the incident needed to be evaluated for public health and safety reasons. They'd transported her to what looked like a standard federal facility, filled out forms that asked all the right questions, and processed her through systems that should have confirmed her identity as Sarah Thompson, freelance photographer. No outstanding warrants, no unusual background markers, but somewhere in that processing, something had gone wrong. Maybe it was the sophisticated background check that had revealed inconsistencies in her cover story. Maybe it was facial recognition software that had matched her to photographs from her previous life. Or maybe it was simply bad luck, the wrong person recognizing something familiar in her face or her body language. Whatever had triggered the additional scrutiny, Sarah now found herself in a high-security quarantine facility, facing questions that went far beyond routine contamination screening. The officials who'd interviewed her over the past 3 days had asked about her photography work, her travel history, her contacts and associations. But underneath the surface questions, she'd sensed deeper suspicions. They knew she wasn't just a photographer who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They suspected she had knowledge or experience that went beyond what her official identity suggested. But they couldn't prove it, couldn't access the classified records that would explain who she really was and why she'd been living under an assumed name. The photography equipment they'd confiscated contained images that were problematic, but not definitively incriminating. Her apartment, which they'd undoubtedly searched, would show evidence of the life she'd built, but nothing that directly contradicted her cover story. Her financial records, her social connections, her documented history, all of it supported the identity she'd constructed. But Sarah knew that eventually, if they looked hard enough, they'd find the cracks. The cover identity was good, but it wasn't perfect. There were small inconsistencies, minor gaps in her documented history, subtle markers that would raise flags for investigators who knew what to look for. More importantly, there were people in various government agencies who would recognize her if they saw her photographs or read detailed reports about her behavior. People who knew Sarah Thompson, freelance photographer, bore a striking resemblance to someone who had once carried a different name and served in capacities that didn't appear in official military records. The quarantine facility was supposed to be a temporary holding area, a place to evaluate potential exposure victims before releasing them back to their normal lives. But Sarah understood that her situation was more complex than that. The questions they'd been asking, the level of security around the facility, the careful way the staff had been treating her, all of it suggested that this was as much about intelligence gathering as medical precaution. Dr. Reynolds seemed genuine in his concern about biological contamination, but Sarah had noticed the way he'd defer to security personnel on certain decisions. The medical staff were clearly following protocols that had been developed by people who understood operational security, as well as public health. And now they wanted her to undress, to submit to complete decontamination procedures that would expose not just her body, but the marks it carried. The scars that told stories about places she'd been and things she'd done. The tattoos that identified her membership in units that weren't supposed to exist. Most civilians carried tattoos that spoke of personal choices, artistic expression, cultural identity. Military personnel often had tattoos that showed unit affiliation, deployment history, and shared experiences with fellow service members. But some tattoos carried meanings that went deeper than unit pride or combat camaraderie. Some tattoos identified people who had served in capacities so classified that their existence was officially denied. People who had been trained for missions that couldn't be acknowledged, deployed to places that didn't appear on maps, asked to do things that couldn't be recorded in official histories. Sarah's tattoos fell into that category. The Barrett .50 caliber rifle inked into her shoulder wasn't just artistic expression or general military symbolism. It was specific, precise, a mark that identified her as someone who had been trained to use that particular weapon system in specialized applications. Applications that required exceptional skill, absolute reliability, and the ability to operate independently in hostile environments. The ink had been applied by someone who understood its significance, in a place where such markings were both recognition and security risk. It connected her to a community of people who shared similar experiences and similar secrets, but it also made her identifiable to anyone who knew how to read the signs. Now, standing in a quarantine facility with federal agents demanding that she expose those marks, Sarah faced a choice that would determine not just her immediate future, but the entire life she'd spent 3 years building. She could continue to maintain her cover, refuse to undress, and accept whatever consequences came from non-compliance. That path might preserve her identity, but would certainly result in more scrutiny, more questions, and eventually the kind of deep investigation that would uncover the truth anyway. Or she could reveal the truth about who she was and what she'd done, knowing that once certain people knew she was alive and in federal custody, her quiet life as Sarah Thompson would be over forever. Either choice carried risks that extended far beyond her personal situation. The photograph she'd taken at the warehouse contained information that could compromise ongoing operations. Her knowledge of biological weapons and containment procedures could be valuable to the right people and dangerous in the wrong hands. And her mere existence raised questions about missions that were supposed to have no survivors. As she stood in that sterile white chamber, listening to Dr. Reynolds explain federal health protocols while security guards watched her every movement, Sarah realized that her carefully constructed, normal life was about to collide with a past she'd tried to leave behind. The question wasn't whether they would discover who she really was. The question was whether she would reveal it herself on her own terms, or let them uncover it piece by piece through investigation and interrogation. Either way, Sarah Thompson, freelance photographer, was about to disappear forever. What remained to be seen was who would take her place. 8 years ago, Staff Sergeant Sarah Michelle Rodriguez had been one of 12 snipers selected for a program that didn't officially exist. The selection process had taken place at a facility buried so deep in the Nevada desert that it required 3 different security clearances just to know its coordinates. The men and women who'd made it through the initial screening were already among the military's elite Marine Scout snipers, Army Rangers, Special Forces operators who'd proven themselves in theaters across the globe. Sarah had been the youngest candidate, and one of only 2 women in the program. She'd earned her place through a combination of exceptional marksmanship scores, psychological evaluations that marked her as unusually stable under extreme stress, and a service record that included 3 tours in Afghanistan where she'd accumulated 47 confirmed kills with a variety of weapon systems, But none of that previous experience had prepared her for what they'd asked her to do in the program that would reshape her understanding of warfare, loyalty, and survival. The official designation was Project Longbow, though the operators simply called it the ranch. The training facility sprawled across 40,000 acres of restricted airspace, complete with mock-up cities, environmental chambers that could simulate everything from Arctic conditions to tropical humidity, and weapons ranges that stretched beyond the horizon. The Barrett M82, a .155 caliber rifle, had been Sarah's primary weapon system, though the training had covered everything from close-quarters combat to explosive demolition. The Barrett was a monster of a weapon, nearly 5 feet long, weighing almost 30 pounds when fully loaded, capable of delivering a .50 BMG, round with enough energy to punch through armored vehicles at ranges exceeding a mile. Sarah had fallen in love with the weapon during her first week of training. Unlike the lighter sniper rifles she'd used in conventional military service, the Barrett demanded absolute precision in every aspect of its operation. The recoil could break ribs if not properly managed. The muzzle blast was loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage without protection. And the logistics of moving and positioning such a massive weapon system required careful planning and exceptional physical conditioning. But when properly employed, the Barrett could eliminate targets that were beyond the reach of any other weapon. Helicopter pilots at extreme range, vehicle engines at distances where return fire was impossible, high-value targets hiding behind cover that would stop conventional rifle rounds. The training had been brutal, designed to push the candidates beyond their previous limits and into territory where conventional military doctrine no longer applied. 20-hour days that included physical conditioning, weapons training, tactical instruction, and psychological conditioning that prepared them for operations where capture meant torture and death, meant leaving no trace of their existence. Of the 12 candidates who'd started the program, only 7 had completed it. 2 had been dismissed for psychological incompatibility with the mission parameters. 1 had suffered a training accident that ended his military career. 2 others had voluntarily withdrawn when they'd understood the full implications of what they were being trained to do. Sarah had been among the 7 who'd graduated, earning the unofficial designation Longbow 7 and the right to carry the Barrett .50 caliber tattoo that marked her as a member of a very exclusive community. The tattoo had been applied by a former Navy SEAL who ran a shop near the base, a man who'd done similar work for various special operations units and understood the significance of the marks he created. The Barrett rifle tattooed on Sarah's shoulder was anatomically perfect, detailed enough that an expert could identify the specific model and configuration. Wrapped around the weapon's barrel was a banner containing coordinates that marked the location of her first mission success. Below that, rendered in Gothic script, were the initials of her spotter, Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb, who died during their 3rd deployment. But the most significant element of the tattoo was the small series of notches carved into the rifle's stock. 13 marks, each representing a mission completion under circumstances that had required extraordinary skill and absolute secrecy. 13 times when Sarah Rodriguez had been deployed to locations that didn't appear on official maps to eliminate targets, whose deaths couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The first mission had been in a country that the United States officially denied having military personnel in. A warlord who'd been selling weapons to terrorist organizations while simultaneously receiving foreign aid from American allies. Intelligence agencies had tracked him for months, building a case that could never be presented in international courts because it would reveal sources and methods that needed to remain classified. Sarah had positioned herself on a ridge 800 meters from the warlord's compound, lying motionless for 14 hours until her target had presented himself. One shot sent her mass from a range that local investigators would assume required heavy military equipment, the kind of equipment that only nation-states possessed. creating a diplomatic incident that would distract from the possibility of a single sniper operation. The mission had been textbook perfect. Infiltration by civilian aircraft, overland movement to the target area, establishing a hide that provided clear fields of fire while remaining undetectable. The shot itself had been routine for someone with Sarah's training, but the implications had been profound. She'd eliminated a target that conventional military operations couldn't touch, creating a power vacuum that had destabilized the region in ways that served American strategic interests, all without leaving any evidence that could be traced back to United States involvement. The subsequent missions had followed similar patterns. High-value targets in locations where conventional military action wasn't politically feasible. Eliminations that needed to look like accidents, assassinations, or local violence rather than precision military operations. Sarah and her team had become ghosts, moving through hostile territory to eliminate problems that couldn't be solved through diplomacy or conventional warfare. The work had been psychologically demanding in ways that regular combat operations weren't. In conventional military service, soldiers fought uniformed enemies representing hostile nations or organizations. The moral framework was clear, the legal justification was established, and the tactical situation was defined by internationally recognized rules of engagement. But longbow operations existed in gray areas where those frameworks didn't apply. Targets were often individuals rather than military formations. Rules of engagement were determined by strategic necessity rather than international law. And success was measured not by territory captured or enemy formations destroyed, but by political situations that shifted in ways that served long-term American interests. Sarah had adapted to the moral complexity with the same methodical precision she'd brought to marksmanship training. She'd compartmentalized the emotional aspects of the work, focusing on technical execution and operational effectiveness. Her mission reports had been models of clinical precision, documenting weather conditions, ammunition expenditure, and target elimination without reference to the human cost of her actions. Marcus Webb had been her constant companion throughout 6 years of deployment, the spotter who'd helped her navigate the psychological as well as tactical challenges of their specialized warfare. Webb had been older, more experienced, a former Marine who'd found his calling in the shadows where conventional military service ended and something more complex began. He'd been the one who'd helped Sarah understand that their work existed outside normal moral frameworks, not because it was immoral, but because it served purposes that couldn't be achieved through conventional means. Democratic societies needed people willing to operate in darkness so that others could live in light. Freedom required violence that couldn't be acknowledged or celebrated. Webb had also been the one who'd recognized the signs when Sarah had begun to crack under the psychological pressure of their work. 6 years of eliminating targets in countries that officially didn't contain American military personnel had accumulated in ways that weren't covered in any training manual. Sleep patterns disrupted by hypervigilance, emotional numbness that extended beyond operational requirements, a growing disconnection from civilian life that made normal relationships impossible. The end had come during their 13th mission. Together, in a mountainous region where 3 different terrorist organizations were competing for control of smuggling routes that funneled money and weapons across international borders. Intelligence had identified a meeting where the leadership of all 3 groups would be present, an opportunity to eliminate multiple high-value targets in a single operation. Sarah had established her hide on a ridge that provided perfect overwatch of the meeting location, a valley where the terrorists would feel secure from surveillance or attack. Webb had positioned himself 300 meters away, using advanced optics to provide target identification and range estimation for shots that would stretch Barrett's capabilities to their limits. The first shot had been perfect, eliminating the primary target at a range of just over 1,400 meters. The second target had begun moving immediately, recognizing the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle. But Sarah had compensated for wind and movement, delivering a second kill shot within 10 seconds of the first. The third target had been more difficult, having reached cover behind a rock formation that provided partial concealment. Sarah had waited, controlling her breathing and heart rate, until the target had exposed himself, enough for a precision shot that required threading the bullet through a gap, barely larger than the projectile itself. All 3 targets had been eliminated within 90 seconds, at ranges and under conditions that would have been impossible for anyone without Sarah's specialized training and equipment. The mission had been tactically flawless, strategically significant, and professionally executed according to the highest standards of precision warfare. But during their extraction, Webb had stepped on an improvised explosive device that local forces had planted along what they'd assumed was their escape route. The explosion had been massive, designed to destroy vehicles rather than eliminate individual personnel. Webb had died instantly, his body so thoroughly destroyed that Sarah had been unable to recover anything more than fragments of his equipment. Sarah had completed the extraction alone, carrying Webb's remains and their classified equipment through hostile territory to an exfiltration point that required 36 hours of movement through terrain that was actively being searched by enemy forces seeking whoever had eliminated their leadership. The psychological impact of losing Webb had been compounded by the nature of their work. In conventional military operations, fallen comrades were honored with ceremonies, remembered in official histories, commemorated with monuments that acknowledged their service and sacrifice. But Webb's death couldn't be officially recognized. Because his mission couldn't be officially acknowledged, Sarah had attended a private memorial service where Webb was identified only by a number, his achievements summarized in language so vague that it revealed nothing about what he'd actually done or where he died. His family had been told that he died in a training accident, his true service record sealed under classification levels that would keep his story hidden for decades. The realization that her own death would be handled the same way had been the beginning of Sarah's decision to leave the program. She'd completed 2 more missions alone, proving that she could operate without a spotter when necessary. But the work had lost its meaning without Webb's presence and perspective. More importantly, she'd begun to understand that she was becoming something that couldn't easily reintegrate into normal society. 6 years of precision killing in service of objectives that couldn't be publicly acknowledged had created psychological adaptations that made civilian life increasingly difficult to navigate. Sarah had submitted her resignation from Project Longbow on the anniversary of Webb's death, formally requesting transfer back to conventional military service. The request had been approved with unusual speed, accompanied by a comprehensive psychological evaluation that had recommended immediate discharge from active duty. The discharge process had included extensive debriefing sessions designed to ensure that classified information remained secure, psychological counseling aimed at facilitating the transition to civilian life, and practical assistance with establishing post-military identity and employment. But the most significant part of the process had been the creation of Sarah Thompson, freelance photographer. The new identity had been crafted by specialists who understood that former special operations personnel often required completely fresh starts to successfully reintegrate into society. The photography cover had been chosen based on psychological profiles that suggested Sarah would find creative expression helpful in processing her military experiences. The freelance structure would allow her to work independently without the interpersonal challenges that traditional employment might present. And the mobile nature of photography work would satisfy the restlessness that often affected people who'd spent years in high-stress operational environments. For 3 years, the new identity had worked perfectly. Sarah had built a life that included genuine friendships, creative satisfaction, and a sense of purpose that didn't require violence or secrecy. She'd believed that her past was safely buried, that Sarah Rodriguez had died with Marcus Webb in those mountains, and that Sarah Thompson could build something resembling a normal life. But now, standing in a quarantine facility with federal agents demanding that she expose the marks that connected her to her previous life, Sarah understood that some transformations were never complete. The tattoo on her shoulder wasn't just ink and artistic expression. It was a permanent connection to a world she'd tried to leave behind. A mark that identified her to anyone who knew how to read the signs. And as Dr. Reynolds waited for her response, as security guards watched her with growing suspicion, Sarah realized that her 3 years of peaceful anonymity were about to end. The Barrett .50 caliber tattoo on her shoulder was about to reveal not just who she'd been, but who she still was underneath the carefully constructed facade of civilian normalcy. Sarah's apartment on Elmwood Avenue had been deliberately chosen for its complete ordinariness. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a galley kitchen that barely fit 2 people, and windows that looked out onto a parking lot filled with decade-old sedans and pickup trucks. The rent was reasonable, the neighbors minded their own business, and the building's security consisted of a front door lock that hadn't been updated since the 1990s. The transformation of Sarah Rodriguez into Sarah Thompson had required more than just paperwork and identification documents. It required learning to live as someone whose biggest daily concern was whether she had enough milk for coffee, whose most stressful decision was choosing between different photography assignments, whose greatest fear was missing a rent payment. Rather than stepping on an improvised, explosive device, the photography equipment that filled her spare bedroom was entirely legitimate. 2 professional camera bodies, a collection of lenses that had cost more than most people spent on cars, lighting equipment for studio work, and a computer setup sophisticated enough to handle the massive files that modern digital photography generated. Sarah had discovered that she possessed a genuine talent for the work, an eye for composition that translated military surveillance skills into artistic expression. Her portfolio contained landscapes from across the Mid-South, architectural studies of Memphis's evolving skyline, and portrait work that captured something authentic in her subjects' faces. The magazine assignments had started small local publications that needed stock images of regional landmarks, but had gradually expanded to include national publications that appreciated her unique perspective on urban decay and renewal. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that some of her most successful photographs were images of abandoned buildings, empty lots, and forgotten spaces. Places where nature was slowly reclaiming human construction, where time had eroded the sharp edges of civilization. There was something peaceful about documenting the slow surrender of concrete and steel to weather and vegetation, a kind of visual meditation on impermanence that helped quiet the hypervigilance that still sometimes kept her awake at night. But the photography was more than just a therapeutic outlet or professional cover. It had become a genuine passion, a way of seeing the world that emphasized beauty rather than threat assessment, composition rather than tactical advantage. Through the camera lens, Sarah had learned to appreciate subtlety, patience, and the kind of precision that created art rather than eliminated targets. Her daily routine had been carefully constructed to reinforce the civilian identity she'd adopted. Morning coffee at the same diner where she'd become friendly with the waitstaff. Grocery shopping at the neighborhood market where she exchanged pleasantries with regular customers. Evening walks through the residential streets where she'd learned to recognize the rhythms of normal family life, children playing in yards, couples walking dogs, teenagers gathering at the corner store. The routine had been comforting in ways that surprised her. After years of unpredictable deployment schedules and mission requirements that could change without warning, there was something deeply satisfying about knowing that Tuesday meant laundry, Thursday meant grocery shopping, and Saturday afternoons were reserved for developing film in her makeshift darkroom. Sarah had even developed what could generously be called a social life. Coffee dates with other freelancers who worked in creative fields. Conversations with neighbors about property taxes and city council elections, casual friendships with people who knew her as someone who took pictures for magazines and paid her rent on time and occasionally borrowed sugar when she was baking cookies. The normalcy had been intoxicating. For the first time since her teenage years, Sarah had been able to go to sleep without conducting perimeter checks or positioning weapons within easy reach. She'd learned to enjoy movies that didn't require analyzing tactical scenarios, books that didn't contain useful information about surveillance or counter-surveillance techniques, conversations that never touched on topics that were classified or morally ambiguous. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the therapist who'd been part of Sarah's transition team, had warned her about the psychological challenges of reintegration, the hypervigilance that would gradually fade but never completely disappear, the startled responses that would persist for years, the difficulty forming intimate relationships with people who couldn't understand the experiences that had shaped her worldview. But Dr. Walsh had also emphasized the importance of genuine engagement with civilian life. The cover identity wasn't just about hiding from the past. It was about building a future that could provide meaning and satisfaction without requiring violence or secrecy. The photography work needed to become more than just professional camouflage. It needed to become something that Sarah genuinely cared about preserving. That investment in civilian life had been tested repeatedly during her 3 years in Memphis. Moments when her training kicked in, automatically scanning crowds for potential threats, noting exit routes in restaurants, instinctively cataloging the weapons potential of everyday objects. Times when she'd caught herself evaluating people as potential targets or assets rather than simply fellow human beings trying to navigate their own complicated lives. The most difficult challenges had been social situations that required sustained interaction with people who lived entirely different lives. Birthday parties where the biggest complaint was traffic congestion. Dinner conversations where people debated the merits of different smartphone models with the kind of intensity that Sarah associated with mission planning. Casual relationships with men who'd never been more than 50 miles from their birthplace and considered military service something that other people did in foreign countries they'd seen in movies. Sarah had learned to navigate these interactions with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to stalking human targets across hostile terrain. She'd developed responses to common questions about her background, strategies for deflecting, conversations that might reveal inconsistencies in her cover story, and techniques for expressing appropriate emotions about civilian concerns that seemed trivial compared to life-and-death decision-making. But gradually, those responses had become less calculated and more genuine. The photography work had provided real satisfaction. The social connections had developed into actual friendships, and the peaceful routine had created space for parts of her personality that had been suppressed during her military service. Sarah had begun to believe that the transformation was complete, that Sarah Rodriguez was truly buried in classified files that would remain sealed for decades, and that Sarah Thompson could build a life worth living without constantly looking over her shoulder for shadows from the past. The warehouse incident had shattered that illusion completely. The moment Sarah had seen the government license plates on the delivery truck, she'd known that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to collide with something from her previous existence. The specialized equipment, the biological containment protocols, the operational security measures, all of it spoke to the kind of classified programs that created problems, requiring unconventional solutions. Her decision to document the incident had been driven by curiosity rather than professional instinct. The photographer in her had been intrigued by the visual contrast between the decrepit warehouse exterior and the sophisticated operation taking place inside. But her military training had recognized the significance of what she was witnessing, a biological weapons incident that would require cleanup efforts extending far beyond standard hazardous material procedures. The photographs she'd taken contained details that could compromise ongoing operations, reveal classified capabilities, and raise questions about activities that weren't supposed to be happening in civilian areas. Intelligence analysts would be able to identify equipment manufacturers, trace personnel assignments, and potentially uncover operational connections that were meant to remain buried in compartmentalized files. More importantly, the incident had attracted the kind of federal attention that would inevitably lead to background investigations, database queries, and the kind of scrutiny that could reveal inconsistencies in her cover identity. The Sarah Thompson persona was sophisticated enough to withstand casual investigation, but not the kind of deep background analysis that would follow a potential biological weapons incident. Sarah had known within hours of being detained that her civilian life was effectively over. The federal agents who'd questioned her had been professional but persistent, asking the kind of detailed questions that suggested they suspected her involvement went beyond accidental exposure to hazardous materials. Her photography equipment had been confiscated, not just as evidence, but as potential intelligence assets that might contain information about classified activities. The quarantine facility had been presented as a medical precaution, but Sarah had recognized the security measures as something more complex. The staff rotations that ensured no single person spent too much time with any particular detainee. The communication restrictions that prevented contact with outside legal representation. The interview techniques that probe for information about background, associations, and knowledge that shouldn't exist in civilian context. Dr. Reynolds seemed genuinely concerned about biological contamination, but Sarah had noticed the way he'd defer to security personnel when making decisions about her case. The medical protocols were real, but they were being implemented within a framework designed to extract intelligence as well as ensure public health safety. The demand that she undress for decontamination had been inevitable. Complete exposure would reveal not just the tattoos that identified her military background, but scars that told stories about combat experiences that weren't supposed to exist in official records. Burn marks from the improvised explosive device that had killed Marcus Webb. Surgical scars from wounds sustained during operations in countries where American military personnel weren't supposed to be present. Most importantly, the Barrett .50 caliber tattoo would immediately identify her to anyone with knowledge of special operations communities. The weapon system wasn't standard issue for conventional military units, and the specific details etched into her skin would mark her as someone who'd been trained in its use for specialized applications. Sarah understood that revealing the tattoo would trigger a cascade of investigations that would uncover her true identity within hours. Database queries would match her biometric data to classified personnel files. Intelligence agencies would be notified that a former longbow operator was in federal custody under circumstances that suggested potential security breaches. The peaceful life she'd built as Sarah Thompson would disappear completely, replaced by the kind of intensive scrutiny that accompanied the reactivation of personnel with access to classified information. Her apartment would be searched, her associates would be investigated, and her activities for the past 3 years would be analyzed for potential security violations or foreign intelligence connections, but the alternative continuing to resist. The decontamination procedures would only delay the inevitable while creating additional complications. Non-compliance with federal health directives would result in criminal charges that would require legal representation she couldn't afford without revealing financial resources that didn't match her cover identity. More importantly, the photographs she'd taken at the warehouse contained information that could be valuable to ongoing investigations. If the biological incident was connected to terrorist activities or foreign intelligence operations, her evidence might be crucial for preventing additional attacks or identifying responsible parties. Standing in the quarantine chamber, watching Dr. Reynolds check his protocols while security guards evaluated her resistance to their directives, Sarah realized that her 3 years of civilian life had been borrowed time. The skills that had kept her alive during her military service, situational awareness, Threat assessment, operational planning had been replaced by artistic sensibilities, social connections, and the kind of peaceful routine that was only possible for people who'd never seen the darker aspects of international relations. But those civilian qualities hadn't made her soft or unprepared for the confrontation that was about to unfold. They'd simply given her something worth protecting, a life she'd built that was worth more than the secret she'd once carried. The Sarah Thompson identity might be about to disappear, but the person she'd become during her 3 years of civilian life had developed strengths that complemented rather than replaced her military training. The Barrett .50 caliber tattoo on her shoulder was about to reveal her past, but it couldn't erase the growth she'd experienced during her years of peaceful anonymity. Whatever happened next, she would face it with both the precision of her military training and the perspective she'd gained from learning to see beauty rather than threats in the world around her. Dr. Reynolds was still waiting for her response, still expecting compliance with decontamination procedures that would expose secrets she'd spent 3 years keeping buried. Sarah looked around the sterile chamber one more time, taking in the faces of people who were about to learn that their routine biological containment situation was actually something far more complex and dangerous. Then she began to lift her tank top, knowing that each inch of exposed skin would bring them closer to revelations that would change everything they thought they understood about Sarah Thompson, freelance photographer, and the quiet woman who'd been living among them with a past that belonged to a world most of them never imagined existed. Sarah's hands moved to the bottom hem of her tank top with deliberate slowness, each movement calculated to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's expectations. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the quarantine chamber as she began to lift the fabric, revealing inch by inch the truth that would transform a routine decontamination procedure into something far more complex and dangerous. Dr. Reynolds felt his pulse quicken as the first hints of scarred tissue became visible along Sarah's ribcage. These weren't the kind of marks that came from civilian accidents or medical procedures. The patterns were too deliberate, too extensive, speaking of trauma sustained under circumstances that didn't align with her documented identity as a freelance photographer. Security Chief Walsh instinctively reached for his radio, though he wasn't sure what he intended to report. Something was happening in this sterile white chamber that went beyond his training and experience. The woman they'd been processing as a potential biological exposure victim was revealing physical evidence of a background that contradicted everything. In her file, Officer Morrison took an unconscious step backward, her hand moving toward her weapon despite explicit protocols against drawing firearms in the quarantine area. Her training had emphasized the importance of maintaining professional composure during medical procedures, but nothing had prepared her for the growing realization that they weren't dealing with an ordinary civilian. Sergeant Briggs watched with the calculating attention of someone who'd seen enough combat to recognize its permanent marks. The scars becoming visible on Sarah's torso weren't random. They followed patterns that suggested specific types of trauma: shrapnel wounds, burns from explosive devices, the kind of injuries that came from close-quarters combat in hostile environments. But it was the edge of the tattoo, beginning to show on Sarah's left shoulder, that made Briggs's breath catch in his throat. Even with only partial visibility, the precision and detail of the artwork was unmistakable. This wasn't civilian body art or conventional military symbolism. The lines were too sharp, the proportions too exact, the subject matter too specific. Sarah paused with her tank top halfway up her torso, meeting Dr. Reynolds' eyes through his protective face shield. "Doctor, I'm going to ask you one more time. Are you absolutely certain you want to see what's underneath this shirt? Because once you do, this becomes a situation that involves people you really don't want to meet and questions you really don't want to answer." Dr. Reynolds found himself caught between medical protocol and growing unease about the implications of what he was witnessing. His training demanded that he proceed with decontamination procedures, regardless of the patient's background or circumstances. But his instincts were screaming that this was no longer a medical situation. "Ma'am, I need you to complete the removal of your clothing so we can proceed with the necessary health and safety protocols," he said, his voice lacking the confidence it had carried just minutes earlier. Sarah nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this response, but wanted to give him every opportunity to reconsider. "Dr. Reynolds, I want you to remember that you insisted on this course of action. When the phone calls start coming from Washington, when people with security clearances you've never heard of start asking questions about your facility, I want you to remember that I tried to warn you." She lifted the tank top over her head in one smooth motion, and the quarantine chamber fell into absolute silence. The Barrett M82A 1.50 caliber rifle, tattooed on Sarah's left shoulder, was rendered in perfect anatomical detail, every component precisely positioned, every measurement accurate to within millimeters. The weapon appeared to be emerging from her flesh itself, the barrel extending down her arm, while the scope and firing mechanism wrapped around her shoulder blade with three-dimensional precision that created the illusion of an actual weapon system integrated into her body. But it was the details surrounding the rifle that made Security Chief Walsh reach instinctively for his sidearm before catching himself. Wrapped around the barrel were coordinates that any military person would recognize as geographic positioning data. Below the weapon, rendered in military stenciling, were the letters LB7, followed by a series of numbers that looked like service identification codes. Most significantly, carved into the rifle's stock were 13 small notches, each one precise and deliberate, each one representing something that made Sergeant Briggs take an involuntary step backward as understanding dawned. "Jesus Christ," Briggs whispered, his voice barely audible through his respirator. "Those are kill marks." The number 13 etched into the tattoo's rifle stock wasn't random decoration or artistic flourish. It was a precise accounting of successful mission completions, each notch representing a target eliminated under circumstances that required the kind of extreme precision that only specialized sniper systems could provide. Dr. Reynolds stared at the tattoo with growing comprehension of how far beyond his expertise the situation had become. The Barrett .50 caliber rifle wasn't standard military equipment. It was a specialized weapon system used for specific applications that fell outside conventional warfare doctrine. The level of detail in the tattoo suggested not just familiarity with the weapon, but the kind of intimate knowledge that came from extensive training and operational use. "Ma'am," Dr. Reynolds' voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, "what exactly is your background?" Sarah stood motionless in the chamber, her scarred torso fully exposed under the harsh lighting. Besides the dominant rifle tattoo, other marks were now visible: surgical scars that spoke of field medicine performed under combat conditions, burn patterns that suggested proximity to explosive devices, and smaller tattoos that contained codes and symbols that would be meaningful only to people with specific military knowledge. "My background, doctor, is the kind that gets discussed in rooms where cell phones aren't allowed and conversations don't get recorded," Sarah replied. "The kind that involves activities in places that don't appear on official maps and missions, that don't exist in any historical record you'll ever have access to." Security Chief Walsh was speaking urgently into his radio, requesting immediate backup and advising his superiors that they had a situation requiring specialized personnel. His words were careful, coded, designed to convey urgency without revealing details over unsecured communication channels. Officer Morrison had gone very pale behind her protective gear. Her training had covered a variety of potential scenarios: violent patients, contaminated materials, security breaches, but nothing had prepared her for discovering that a routine decontamination subject possessed the kind of background that required federal intervention. "The coordinates on your tattoo," Sergeant Briggs said, his voice tight with recognition. "Those aren't random numbers." Sarah turned to look at him directly, and Briggs felt the full weight of her attention like a physical force. Her green eyes held depths of experience that had nothing to do with freelance photography and everything to do with the kind of work that left permanent marks on both body and soul. "No, Sergeant, they're not random," Sarah confirmed. "They mark the location of my first confirmed long-range elimination. A target at 1,400 meters in a country that the United States military officially denies having personnel in. Would you like me to describe the weather conditions that day? The wind speed that required a 6-inch holdover? The way the target fell when a .50 BMG round, traveling at 2,800 feet per second, punched through his center mass?" The room's atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as a routine medical procedure had become something resembling an interrogation of a prisoner of war, except that the prisoner appeared to be in complete control of the situation, despite being partially undressed and surrounded by armed guards. Dr. Reynolds realized that his hands were shaking as he attempted to maintain some semblance of medical authority over a situation that had become entirely beyond his control. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to provide complete identification and a full accounting of your medical history, including any potential exposure to biological or chemical agents during your previous service." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested amusement at the doctor's attempt to regain control over circumstances that were rapidly escalating beyond the scope of a quarantine facility. "Doctor, my medical history is classified at levels that require congressional approval to access. My service record exists in databases that your facility doesn't have clearance to query. And my exposure to biological and chemical agents includes substances that your laboratory doesn't have the equipment to test for and wouldn't know how to treat if they found them." She gestured toward the observation window where CDC officials were undoubtedly recording everything and frantically making phone calls to supervisors who would have no idea how to handle this development. "But since you insisted on this course of action, let me give you the information you're going to need for your reports." Staff Sergeant Sarah Michelle Rodriguez, Service Number 2847663912005, formerly attached to a unit designation that you don't have clearance to know. Medically discharged 3 years ago with a new identity and specific instructions to avoid exactly this kind of situation. Security Chief Walsh had stepped back toward the chamber's exit, positioning himself between Sarah and the door while maintaining communication with external security forces. His body language suggested someone preparing for a potentially violent confrontation, though Sarah remained completely motionless in the center of the room. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your head and move slowly toward the wall," Walsh commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling dangerous situations. Sarah looked at him with what might have been pity. "Chief Walsh, I'm going to explain something that might save you from making a mistake that could end your career and possibly your life. I am standing completely still in the middle of this room wearing nothing but underwear, surrounded by 4 armed guards in body armor in a facility that's undoubtedly been locked down and surrounded by additional security forces." She paused to let the tactical situation sink in before continuing. "If I had wanted to hurt anyone in this room, I would have done it before revealing my identity. If I had wanted to escape, I would have left before allowing myself to be brought to this facility. And if I pose the kind of threat that requires restraint and interrogation, then you need to understand that the people who trained me to be that threat are going to be very interested in why their carefully constructed cover identity has been compromised." The implications of her words settled over the room like a toxic cloud. Officer Morrison was beginning to understand that they weren't just dealing with a former soldier. They were dealing with someone whose very existence represented classified information that wasn't supposed to be accessible to civilian law enforcement or medical personnel. Dr. Reynolds felt the weight of professional and legal liability crushing down on his shoulders. Whatever Sarah Rodriguez's actual background might be, the fact that she'd been living under an assumed identity suggested federal witness protection or intelligence community involvement. Either scenario meant that his facility was now the center of a situation that could have national security implications. The warehouse incident that brought me to your attention, Sarah continued, involved materials and personnel that are connected to ongoing classified operations. The photographs I took contain information that could compromise those operations or reveal capabilities that aren't supposed to be publicly known. She looked directly at the observation window where government officials were undoubtedly scrambling to contact agencies with appropriate clearance levels to handle this development. And now you've forced me to reveal an identity that was supposed to remain buried, creating a security breach that's going to require investigation and remediation at levels that will involve people who make federal judges nervous. The quarantine chamber had become completely silent except for the constant hum of ventilation systems and the crackling of radio communications as Security Chief Walsh continued requesting guidance from supervisors who were probably as confused as he was. Sarah stood motionless in the center of the room, her Barrett .50 caliber tattoo clearly visible under the harsh lighting. 13 kill marks etched into the rifle stock like a permanent record of missions that had never officially existed. The scars covering her torso told additional stories about combat in environments that civilian medical personnel were never supposed to encounter. So Dr. Reynolds, Sarah said quietly, now that you've seen what you insisted on seeing, what exactly do you plan to do with this information? Because I can guarantee you that within the next hour, people with security clearances that require polygraph examinations just to apply for are going to be asking you very pointed questions about how you handled this situation. The fluorescent lights continued their angry buzzing overhead. The air filtration systems continued their constant whir, and in the observation window, government officials continued taking notes that would soon become part of classified reports that most people would never have access to. But everyone in that sterile white chamber understood that they had crossed a line from routine medical procedure into something far more complex and dangerous. Something that would have consequences extending far beyond the walls of the Memphis Biological Containment Facility. Sarah Rodriguez, formerly Sarah Thompson, stood exposed under those harsh lights with 13 kill marks tattooed on her shoulder, and stories carved into her flesh that spoke of service in shadows, where heroes didn't get parades and sacrifice didn't get acknowledged in official histories. And now those shadows were about to reach into the fluorescent-lit world of civilian medicine and federal bureaucracy, bringing with them questions that no one in that room was prepared to answer, and consequences that would reach far beyond anything they could imagine. The first phone call came exactly 37 minutes after Sarah had revealed her tattoo. Dr. Reynolds watched his secure line light up with an incoming call from a number he didn't recognize, displaying a priority classification that he'd never seen before. The caller identified himself only as Deputy Director Harrison and spoke with the kind of quiet authority that made it clear this conversation would determine the immediate future of everyone in the quarantine facility. Dr. Reynolds, you have a situation that requires immediate containment. Harrison's voice carried through the encrypted speaker system. The individual in your custody is not to be moved, questioned, or processed through standard channels. You are to maintain current security protocols until specialized personnel arrive to assume jurisdiction. Dr. Reynolds found himself gripping the phone with hands that still trembled from the adrenaline of the past hour. Sir, I need to understand the legal framework we're operating under. This facility is designed for biological containment, not detention of military personnel. If Ms. Rodriguez requires specialized handling, shouldn't she be transferred to appropriate federal facilities? The pause on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Dr. Reynolds began to wonder if the connection had been lost. When Harrison finally responded, his voice carried undertones that made it clear the doctor was asking questions that ventured into territory where civilian medical personnel weren't supposed to tread. "Doctor, the individual you're dealing with doesn't exist in any official capacity. Her current identity was created through programs that operate under executive authority that supersedes normal judicial oversight. Any transfer or release would require coordination with agencies that don't acknowledge her existence." The implications settled over Dr. Reynolds like a suffocating blanket. He was dealing with someone whose very presence created legal and operational complications that extended far beyond his facility's capacity to handle. Sarah Rodriguez wasn't just a former soldier, she was a ghost in the federal system. Someone whose official non-existence created paradoxes that couldn't be resolved through normal bureaucratic channels. Meanwhile, in the quarantine chamber, Sarah had been provided with a standard medical gown and was sitting calmly on the examination table while Security Chief Walsh maintained his position near the door. The dramatic tension of the tattoo revelation had given way to a strange calm as everyone waited for developments that were clearly beyond their control. Officer Morrison had been relieved of duty and escorted to a debriefing room where she was being questioned by federal agents who'd arrived with remarkable speed, considering the facility's remote location. Her exposure to classified information during the confrontation required evaluation and possibly remediation through channels that operated outside normal law enforcement protocols. Sergeant Briggs remained in the chamber, but his role had shifted from security guard to unofficial liaison. His military background gave him context for understanding what Sarah represented, even if the specifics of her service remained beyond his clearance level. He stood at attention near the observation window, no longer watching Sarah as a potential threat but recognizing her as someone whose rank and experience commanded respect despite the unusual circumstances. "Sergeant," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying across the sterile chamber, "how long did you serve?" Briggs turned toward her, grateful for the opportunity to establish some kind of normal communication after the surreal events of the past. 12 years, ma'am. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. Military police with some attached duty to special operations units." Sarah nodded with understanding that spoke to shared experiences and common ground that transcended their current circumstances. "You've seen enough to recognize what this situation represents. Your facility is about to become the center of attention from people who don't normally involve themselves in civilian medical operations." "Yes, ma'am, I understand that," Briggs replied. "Can I ask, are you concerned about your safety? I mean, if your cover identity has been compromised." The question hung in the air between them, touching on implications that neither of them could fully articulate. If Sarah's carefully constructed civilian life had been exposed through this incident, there might be people who viewed that exposure as a security risk requiring permanent resolution. "Sergeant, the people who created my current identity did so because they wanted me to have a normal life after my service ended. They invested considerable resources in ensuring that Sarah Thompson could exist without connection to Sarah Rodriguez. But they also understood that covers can be blown, identities can be compromised, and sometimes the past catches up despite everyone's best efforts." She gestured toward the observation window where government officials were engaged in intense conversations that were undoubtedly being recorded and analyzed by people with security clearances that required congressional oversight. What happens next depends on whether this incident is viewed as an accidental exposure that can be managed, or a deliberate breach that requires more serious intervention. The photographs I took at the warehouse either contain information that's valuable enough to justify the complications of my reactivation, or they represent a security risk that needs to be neutralized. The door to the quarantine chamber opened with a distinctive hiss of pressurized seals, and 3 individuals in civilian clothes entered with the purposeful movement of people accustomed to handling sensitive situations. The leader was a woman, in her 50s, gray-haired and professionally dressed, who carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone whose authority didn't require demonstration. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," the woman said, using Sarah's military rank rather than her civilian identity. "I'm Director Catherine Stone, Defense Intelligence Agency. We need to discuss your current situation and determine the best path forward for all concerned parties." Sarah straightened automatically, military bearing reasserting itself despite the medical gown and unusual circumstances. "Ma'am, I assume you've been briefed on the events that led to this situation. I want to emphasize that I didn't seek this exposure and took all reasonable steps to maintain operational security consistent with my cover identity." Director Stone nodded, consulting a tablet that contained information about Sarah's background and current circumstances. "Your conduct has been exemplary, Sergeant. The photographs you took at the warehouse incident contain intelligence that's valuable to ongoing operations. Your accidental involvement has actually provided crucial information that we might not have obtained through conventional surveillance." The relief in the room was palpable as it became clear that Sarah's exposure was being viewed as an asset rather than a liability. Dr. Reynolds felt the crushing weight of federal investigation lifting from his shoulders as he realized that his facility had inadvertently aided rather than compromised national security operations. "However," Director Stone continued, "your cover identity has been irreparably compromised. Too many people have seen information that connects Sarah Thompson to Sarah Rodriguez. We need to discuss options for your immediate future." Sarah had expected this development from the moment she decided to reveal her tattoo. The peaceful life she'd built over the past 3 years was effectively over, destroyed by the same circumstances that had brought federal attention to the warehouse incident. But she'd also known that trying to maintain the cover under intensive federal scrutiny would have been impossible anyway. "Ma'am, I understand that reintegration into civilian life under a new identity would require significant resources and time that might not be available given current operational requirements," Sarah said. "I'm prepared to accept reactivation, if that's what the situation demands." Director Stone studied Sarah carefully, evaluating not just her words but her demeanor, body language, and psychological state. The transition from military service to civilian life was difficult under the best circumstances. Forced reactivation after 3 years of peaceful anonymity carried psychological risks that needed to be carefully considered. "Sergeant, your specialized skills are certainly valuable, but reactivation isn't our only option. The intelligence community has positions that could utilize your background without requiring return to active combat operations, analysis, training, consultation on specialized weapon systems roles that would provide meaningful work while allowing you to maintain some connection to the civilian life you've built." The offer represented a compromise that Sarah hadn't expected. Rather than choosing between complete reactivation or witness protection under a new identity, she was being presented with options that might allow her to bridge her military experience with the personal growth she'd achieved during her years as Sarah Thompson. "What about the people who knew me as Sarah Thompson?" she asked. "The friends I've made, the professional relationships I've developed, the life I've built in Memphis?" Director Stone's expression softened slightly, acknowledging the human cost of the situation they were all navigating. Those relationships represent genuine connections that shouldn't be completely severed if it's possible to avoid it. With appropriate security measures, you might be able to maintain some of those connections while transitioning to work that utilizes your specialized background. Dr. Reynolds cleared his throat, drawing attention to the medical aspects of the situation that had been overshadowed by the intelligence implications. "Director Stone, from a health and safety perspective, do we still need to complete the decontamination procedures? The biological exposure concerns that brought Ms. Rodriguez to our facility haven't been addressed. Doctor, our analysis of the Warehouse incident indicates that the biological agents involved pose minimal risk to personnel who weren't directly involved in the containment breach. Director Stone replied, "Standard decontamination protocols will be sufficient, and we can expedite the medical clearance process." The revelation that the biological threat had been less serious than initially believed added another layer of irony to the situation. Sarah's cover had been blown not because of a genuinely dangerous exposure, but because of an abundance of caution in responding to what had turned out to be a relatively minor incident. Security Chief Walsh, who had remained silent throughout the exchange between Sarah and Director Stone, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, what are the protocols for my personnel who were exposed to classified information during this incident? Officer Morrison is particularly concerned about the career implications. Your team's exposure will be handled through standard compartmentalization procedures," Director Stone assured him. "Additional security clearances, periodic reinvestigation, and specific restrictions on discussing any aspect of this incident. But no punitive measures. Your people were following proper protocols under unusual circumstances." The atmosphere in the quarantine chamber had shifted from tension and uncertainty to something resembling resolution. The immediate crisis had been contained, the intelligence implications had been addressed, and frameworks were being established for managing the longer-term consequences of Sarah's exposure. But for Sarah herself, the resolution represented the end of one life and the beginning of something entirely different. The quiet photographer who'd spent 3 years documenting the beauty in abandoned buildings and forgotten spaces was about to be replaced by someone whose future would once again be shaped by classification levels and operational requirements. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Director Stone said, "you'll be debriefed over the next several days while we finalize arrangements for your transition. The photographs you took contain information that could be crucial for ongoing operations, and your tactical knowledge of the weapon systems involved in the warehouse incident could provide valuable insights." Sarah nodded, understanding that she was being offered the opportunity to contribute to something meaningful while transitioning away from civilian life that was no longer sustainable. The Barrett .50 caliber tattoo on her shoulder had revealed not just her past, but opened doorways to a future that would combine her specialized military skills with the personal growth she'd achieved during her years of civilian anonymity. "Ma'am, I appreciate the consideration being given to preserving what can be preserved of the life I've built," Sarah said. "I understand that operational security requirements will limit what's possible, but I'm grateful that complete severance isn't the only option." Dr. Reynolds watched the exchange with a growing understanding of how far beyond his normal experience this situation had traveled. What had begun as a routine biological exposure screening had become a window into worlds that existed parallel to civilian society, inhabited by people whose service required sacrifices that most citizens never imagined. The quarantine facility would return to its normal operations within days, processing routine exposure cases and maintaining public health safety without the dramatic complications of classified personnel and intelligence implications. But the staff who'd been present during Sarah's revelation would carry the knowledge that their mundane medical facility had briefly intersected with the hidden infrastructure that protected national security through methods that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. As Director Stone prepared to escort Sarah from the quarantine chamber for the extensive debriefing process that would determine her future, Sarah looked around the sterile white room one final time. The fluorescent lights still buzzed overhead. The air filtration systems still maintained their constant hum, but the space had been transformed from a simple medical facility into the place where Sarah Thompson had died and Sarah Rodriguez had been reborn. The 13 kill marks tattooed on her shoulder represented missions that had officially never happened, targets eliminated in service of objectives that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. But they also represented skills and experiences that could continue to serve important purposes even if those purposes might be different from the precision killing that had originally defined her. Military value. The Barrett .50 caliber rifle, etched into her skin, would always mark her as someone who'd operated in the shadows where democracy's difficult work gets done by people willing to carry burdens that can't be shared. But it would also serve as a reminder that service could take many forms, and that the precision and dedication that made someone effective in combat could be channeled toward objectives that were built rather than destroyed. As Sarah walked out of the quarantine chamber, escorted by federal agents who would help determine her next chapter, she carried with her both the weight of secrets that would never be fully revealed, and the hope that her future could honor both her military service and the personal growth she'd achieved during her brief years of peaceful anonymity. 6 months after the incident at the Memphis Biological Containment Facility, Dr. Mitchell Reynolds received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a stunning black and white image of an abandoned warehouse at sunset, shadows and light creating a composition that spoke to both beauty and melancholy. On the back, in handwriting he recognized, were the words, "Some perspectives can only be captured by those who've seen both darkness and light. Thank you for helping me find my way back to the camera. S." The photograph now hangs in Dr. Reynolds' office, a reminder of the day his understanding of service, sacrifice, and the hidden complexities of protecting a free society had been fundamentally altered. He'd never spoken publicly about the events. In the quarantine chamber, bound by security agreements that would remain in effect for the rest of his career. But the image served as a daily reminder that the world contained depths he'd never imagined and heroes whose stories would never be told in history books. Sarah Rodriguez had been officially reinstated with a new identity that bridged her civilian and military experiences. Working as a senior analyst for a defense contractor, she provided consultation on precision weapon systems while maintaining a photography studio that specialized in documentary work about veterans' transitions to civilian life. The compromise solution had allowed her to honor both sides of her experience, the warrior who'd served in shadows and the artist who'd learned to see beauty in forgotten places. Her new apartment overlooked the Mississippi River, with large windows that provided the natural light essential for her photography work. The walls displayed images from her civilian years alongside technical drawings of weapon systems that represented her current professional responsibilities. It was a life that acknowledged the full spectrum of her experience, without trying to hide or compartmentalize the different aspects of who she'd become. The Barrett .50 caliber tattoo remained visible on her shoulder, no longer a secret that needed hiding, but a mark of service that commanded respect from those who understood its significance. During briefings with military personnel, the tattoo served as immediate credibility, identifying her as someone who'd proven herself under circumstances that went beyond conventional warfare. Among her photography clients, veterans who'd struggled with their own transitions to civilian life, it represented understanding and shared experience that couldn't be faked. But the most significant change was in how Sarah viewed the intersection of her military and civilian identities. For 3 years, she'd believed that Sarah Rodriguez needed to die completely for Sarah Thompson to live authentically. The quarantine incident had revealed that integration rather than compartmentalization was possible, that the skills and experiences from her military service could enhance rather than compromise her civilian pursuits. Her photography had evolved to include work that specifically documented the stories of special operations veterans transitioning to civilian life. Through her lens, she captured the complexity of people who'd served in classified capacities, whose sacrifices couldn't be publicly acknowledged, but whose struggles with reintegration were real and ongoing. The images told stories about heroism that didn't fit traditional narratives, service that happened in shadows, and the challenge of building normal lives after extraordinary experiences. One photograph in particular had gained recognition in veteran advocacy circles. It showed the hands of a former special operations medic, scars visible across knuckles and palms, gently tending to seedlings in a community garden. The contrast between hands that had delivered both violence and healing, now nurturing new life, captured something essential about the complexity of military service and the possibility of transformation. Sarah's consulting work had proven equally valuable. Her intimate knowledge of precision weapon systems, combined with her understanding of the psychological demands of specialized warfare, made her insights crucial for training programs and equipment development. She'd helped design simulation systems that better prepared snipers for the mental challenges of long-range elimination, drawing on her own experience to improve preparation for operations that couldn't be discussed in conventional military training environments. The 13 mission completions represented by the notches in her tattoo had become the foundation for expertise that served constructive rather than destructive purposes. Each eliminated target had taught her something about precision, patience, and the weight of irreversible decisions. Those lessons now informed training programs that helped other operators understand the full implications of their specialized roles. Dr. Reynolds had also been changed by the encounter. His medical practice had expanded to include consultation on the healthcare needs of personnel with classified service records. The challenge of providing medical care to people whose complete health histories couldn't be accessed through normal channels required creative approaches and enhanced security protocols. He'd learned that the veteran population included individuals whose service had involved exposures and experiences that didn't appear in conventional medical literature. Chemical agents from classified weapons programs, psychological trauma from operations that couldn't be discussed in traditional therapy settings, physical injuries sustained in countries where American military personnel weren't supposed to be present. The quarantine facility had been upgraded with enhanced security capabilities and protocols for handling personnel with classified backgrounds. Dr. Reynolds' staff had received additional training on recognizing the signs of specialized military service and the security considerations that such recognition required. Most importantly, Dr. Reynolds had gained a deeper appreciation for the hidden infrastructure that protected civilian society. The realization that people like Sarah Rodriguez moved through ordinary communities, carrying extraordinary burdens while maintaining the appearance of normal civilian lives, had fundamentally altered his understanding of patriotism and service. Sergeant Tommy Briggs had requested and received additional security clearances that allowed him to work more closely with veterans who carried classified service records. His military police background and the insight gained from the quarantine incident had qualified him for positions that required understanding of the unique challenges faced by special operations personnel transitioning to civilian life. He'd become an advocate within the veteran services community for recognizing that some service members faced reintegration challenges that couldn't be addressed through conventional programs. The psychological demands of classified service, the difficulty of building civilian relationships when significant portions of personal history couldn't be shared, and the challenge of finding meaningful post-military careers that utilize specialized skills all required approaches that acknowledge the unique nature of shadow warfare. Officer Janet Morrison had chosen to pursue federal law enforcement career opportunities that built on her exposure to classified personnel and operations. The security clearances and specialized training that resulted from the quarantine incident had opened doors to positions with agencies that dealt regularly with the intersection of national security and civilian law enforcement. Her experience with Sarah had taught her that assumptions about people's backgrounds could be dangerously misleading, and that effective law enforcement required understanding that some individuals carried experiences and knowledge that went far beyond what their apparent circumstances suggested. Security Chief Brandon Walsh had implemented new protocols for his facility that acknowledged the possibility of encountering personnel with classified backgrounds during routine operations. His staff now received training on recognizing the signs of specialized military service and the appropriate procedures for handling situations that might involve classified information or personnel. The changes had improved the facility's capability to handle unusual situations while maintaining the security standards required for sensitive operations. But more importantly, Walsh had gained respect for the complexity of the veteran population and the hidden sacrifices that some service members made to protect civilian society. The warehouse incident that had triggered Sarah's exposure had been resolved through intelligence gathered from her photographs and analysis. The biological agents involved had been contained and the responsible parties identified and neutralized through operations that would never appear in public records. Sarah's accidental involvement had actually provided crucial intelligence that prevented a larger security breach, but the incident had also highlighted the importance of understanding that military service took many forms, some of which couldn't be publicly acknowledged or celebrated. The precision killing that had defined Sarah's military career represented one extreme of specialized service, but the spectrum included intelligence gathering, weapons development, training, and analysis, all crucial for national security, but rarely visible to civilian society. The broader implications of Sarah's story extended beyond individual experience to questions about how democratic societies honor service that can't be publicly acknowledged. Veterans whose most significant contributions involved classified operations faced unique challenges in finding meaning and recognition for their sacrifices. Sarah's photography project had begun documenting these hidden stories, creating visual narratives that honored classified service without revealing specific operational details. The images captured the humanity of people who'd served in shadows, showing their struggles and triumphs during the transition to civilian life, while respecting the security requirements that kept their specific experiences hidden. One exhibition, displayed at a Veterans Center in Washington, D.C., had drawn attention from policymakers who were beginning to understand that conventional veteran services programs didn't address the needs of all military personnel. The photograph showed the faces of people who'd served with distinction in capacities that couldn't be discussed, whose sacrifices deserved recognition even if the details of their service remained classified. The exhibition had contributed to policy discussions about expanding veteran services to include specialized programs for personnel with classified service records. The challenge of providing appropriate healthcare, employment assistance, and psychological support to veterans whose complete service histories couldn't be shared required innovative approaches that acknowledged their unique circumstances. Sarah's story had become, in its own small way, part of a larger conversation about the hidden costs of protecting democratic society. The precision violence that characterized modern special operations created psychological and social challenges that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Communities that benefited from such protection rarely understood the human cost of maintaining their security, but Sarah's transition had also demonstrated that integration was possible, that skills developed for warfare could be channeled toward constructive purposes, and that the psychological challenges of specialized military service could be addressed through approaches that honored rather than buried military experience. The military service could be addressed through approaches that honored rather than buried military experience. The military service, the honored military service. Barrett .50 caliber tattoo that had ended her anonymous civilian life had ultimately become the foundation for a more authentic existence that acknowledged the full spectrum of her capabilities and experiences. The 13 mission completions represented not just targets eliminated, but lessons learned about precision, responsibility, and the weight of irreversible actions, insights that informed everything from training programs to artistic expression. Her photography now captured moments of transformation and healing. documenting the resilience of people who'd served in extraordinary circumstances, and documenting the resilience of people who'd served in extraordinary circumstances, and the connaissances, possibility of building meaningful lives that honored military experience while embracing civilian opportunities. The same eye for detail that had made her effective at eliminating targets at extreme ranges now revealed beauty in moments of human connection and growth. The precision that had once been channeled toward ending lives was now directed toward preserving moments that celebrated the possibility of renewal. The strength found in vulnerability and the courage required to build authentic relationships. After carrying secrets that couldn't be shared in her studio, surrounded by images that told stories about transformation and resilience, Sarah reflected on the journey from the sterile quarantine chamber, where her carefully constructed civilian identity had been destroyed, to the integrated life she'd built that honored both her military service and her artistic growth. The fluorescent-lit medical facility where Dr. Reynolds had insisted on complete decontamination had become the place where she'd learned that wholeness didn't require hiding essential aspects of who she was. The Barrette .50 caliber tattoo that had seemed like a dangerous revelation had become a mark of authenticity that connected her to communities of service and artistic expression that valued both precision and humanity. The 13 notches carved into the tattooed rifle stock would always represent missions that couldn't be discussed in official histories, targets eliminated in service of objectives that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. But they also represented the foundation for expertise that now served constructive purposes, training that prepared other warriors while honoring the weight of specialized service. Sarah Rodriguez had learned that some tattoos tell stories that can't be spoken aloud, but that the lessons they represent can be shared through actions that build rather than destroy, create rather than eliminate, and heal rather than wound. The precision that had once been channeled toward ending lives was now directed toward capturing and preserving moments that celebrated the possibility of transformation, the beauty found in resilience, and the courage required to build authentic lives after carrying burdens that most people could never imagine. Sometimes the quietest people carry the heaviest stories, and sometimes the most important service happens in shadows where recognition is impossible, but sacrifice is absolute. Sarah's story was a reminder that heroism takes many forms, that transformation is possible even after the most specialized training, and that the skills developed for warfare can ultimately serve the cause of peace through understanding, documentation, and the patient work of helping others find their own paths toward healing and wholeness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.